Welcome to this British Psychological Society audio interview. I'm Wendy Barnaby and I'm joined by Richard Crisp, Professor of Psychology at the Aston Business School. And Richard, you've just received a very distinguished award from the Society for your work, so many congratulations. And we're going to be talking about your work on understanding prejudice, the prejudice that one people feels for another.
I've always been fascinated by the way that people categorise themselves in different ways, whether this be in terms of occupation, their sports team allegiance, their hobbies, and of course in terms of nationality or gender, religion, ethnicity. This always seemed to me to be one of the most fundamental ways in which people seem to describe themselves. And in fact, it turned out there is research on this which shows that if you ask people how they would describe themselves in just 3 words, if they met someone new, then those 3 words would be some sort of social category or social identity. So it does seem to be that these fundamental differences between people are one of the things which are absolutely central to how people see themselves and also how they think about society and think about other people.
You've thought of a way that enables people to be less prejudiced towards people of other groups. What does it involve?
About 50 years ago, actually, a pioneering social psychologist called Gordon Allport came up with something called the contact hypothesis. And the idea was that one of the reasons why groups don't get along is lack of interaction. It's to do with the human mind's desire for security and safety and that sort of thing. We like to build silos around us. And Gordon Allport's idea was that if we try and challenge that tendency to kind of shut ourselves away and only associate with people from our own group on whatever basis that may be, then this can lead to changes in how we think about other people in society, and then can lead to improvements in intergroup relations. And one of the insights that I've had with my colleagues in doing research on contact was that, well, that's great, and once you've achieved contact, that's great, you can build upon that. One of the problems, of course, which defines things like prejudice is not only the lack of opportunity for contact, but the lack of inclination to engage in contact. There is this basic psychological tendency, which many people have, to not want to engage in contact, to not have any particular interest in engaging in contact. And if they found themselves in a situation where they had to interact, then they might feel a bit anxious about this and not feel particularly confident about it. So that led us to come up with this idea of devising a training intervention or a mental simulation intervention to try and encourage engagement with contact, to get people to take that first step.
This is to take a first step for actual physical face-to-face involvement, contact.
Absolutely, and we know that face-to-face contact is incredibly effective. So we thought, well, how do you do this? And actually we looked at some research in a number of different areas of psychology, and in particular clinical psychology and in sports psychology. In both of these areas, we found that mental imagery, mental simulation techniques were used to get people to take that first step to carry out a particular type of behaviour, which they might want to do but may not feel able to do or may not feel confident in doing.
So this is actually to get people to think about how it would be to interact with members of the other group, although they're not actually interacting with it.
Absolutely, and then the analogy is in sports psychology, for instance, where there's research which shows that if you want to encourage weightlifters to lift heavier weights, then you get them to go through this kind of structured mental simulation exercise in which they imagine lifting those weights beforehand. And it sounds very simple, but the human mind's capacity for imagination is huge, of course. And what neuroscience research has shown is that when you imagine these actions, it kind of exercises precisely those parts of the brain which are also to do with enacting the action. So we thought, well, what if you could do that in intergroup context? What if you could do this to try and encourage people to engage in intergroup contact? And so we came up with this very simple exercise, which we called imagined contact.
What sort of groups did you have, and what sort of groups were they imagining that they were having contact with?
Young people thinking about engaging with older people. It could be white people thinking about engaging with black people. It could be Christians thinking about interacting with Muslims. So a whole range of different groups, and the technique has been found to be effective with all of these groups.
Do you actually talk them through it, or do you say, now I want you to think of greeting this person, now I want you to think of having a conversation? How does it go?
We've kind of boiled it down to two simple criteria. One is engagement in some sort of interaction. It's not enough just to think about the person or the group in question. There has to be this kind of process of engaging in some sort of conversation and interaction. And of course, the second key criteria is that interaction has to be positive. If people engage think about a negative interaction, that kind of makes things worse. That said, what a lot of research is doing now is identifying ways to facilitate the effectiveness of the approach. For instance, by getting people to imagine the interaction from a third person perspective. Imagine looking down on yourself engaged in a positive interaction with someone from a different culture or a different group. This seems to be more effective than just giving them the simple instruction on its own. And there are very good psychological reasons for this, because one of the things we know that what happens when people take this kind of disembodied or third person perspective, the kind of spotlight is on you. You're looking at yourself, and it gets people to engage in what's called a kind of metacognitive process, where you reflect on yourself. What sort of person am I? Am I the sort of person who gets on well with people from lots of different cultures? And it seems to lead to a more elaborated or in-depth process arising from the simulated encounter.
And of course, then you're thinking of yourself and how am I doing? Am I interacting properly? Rather than thinking, what about the other person? Are they interacting? And so from that point of view too, I suppose it's pretty salutary.
Absolutely, and I think it's that process of getting people to, well, first of all, think about something which they wouldn't normally think about. I mean, a great deal of research on prejudice and discrimination and the way in which people think about diversity is characterised by the fact that people don't think about it. People kind of shut themselves off from thinking about these things. And what these tasks do is encourage people to, well, actually, what would it be like if I had a positive interaction with someone from this group or that group? And just by kind of opening the door to that possibility, it seems to lead to a kind of a snowball effect, and it kind of broadens people's minds.
Do you have input into public policy? Because one of the terribly discussed and controversial things in such a multicultural country as ours is, should you encourage multiculturalism, everybody observing their own cultural norms, or should you just say, we all live here, we're going to be colourblind, we're going to be religion blind, we all have to do everything, this is the way it's going to be? Can you help in that sort of discussion?
Absolutely. I think there is a need to try and bring these things into the public domain and to see if they can indeed do some good. And that is very much the focus of the work I'm doing now.
I suppose it's important, isn't it, perhaps, to say we're going to have a multicultural society and we're going to try and make it work, because these things that make up the different cultures are really people's identity, aren't they? And it's very difficult to say, well, actually I'm a Muslim, but for the sake of societal cohesion, I'm going to forget that I'm a Muslim. You can't do that. You've got to be able to bring what you are into a positive interaction.
Absolutely, and there is a great deal of research now which shows that if you try to get people to ignore their identity, or to sort of categorise themselves differently, or to think about themselves as British and to forget everything else that defines who they are, it doesn't work. People react against that, and of course they do, because our categories and our identities are so important to us. They are what we are. That doesn't work psychologically, but research is also showing that not only does that not work, there are huge benefits to getting people to see these identities as being able to coexist side by side. Because when they do that, it engages in this ability to be able to hold two things in mind at the same time, two identities in one's mind at the same time. This is the hallmark of things like creative thought or problem solving. The ability to do that is really important for people, and I think acknowledging not only that it's impossible to get people to forget about the identities that define who they are, but also there are huge benefits from getting people to simultaneously categorise themselves. I think recognising that is a really important step forward.